So over the last lectures, we learned a lot about transition. Now, sometimes you don't want to control the transition as we do here, where we get this function with the state and where we then manually attach CSS classes or change the style. We can, of course, do this. We are doing this in both the app.js file and our modal.js file. But sometimes you just want to have a couple of predefined CSS classes for the different animation states, and you want to make sure they get attached depending on the state of the animation. Essentially what we're doing here manually would be nice if that would be managed automatically. And turns out the package we're using has a special CSSTransition component. So let's import that from the CSSTransition subpackage. Let's also use it then here in our JSX code. CSSTransition doesn't use any function in between the tags. Instead, you just enter the JSX code you want to output, like that. Class name therefore now can be set back to modal. Right now, this wouldn't have any animation. We just have the CSSTransition element. If we now go back to the application, click open modal, now we actually even get this error right now if we're using it. The reason for this error is due to the way this component works. We need to add a special property to CSSTransition component, which is called class names. Not class name as we use it on other properties, class names. Because here we define which CSS classes should be added to the wrapped element, so to this div, depending on the state of the transition. It will always keep the classes we had on the element, like modal in our case, but then merge these new classes with that. Now, what are these new classes though? We can define the trunk of these classes, so to say. For example, we could name this fade-slide, and you can use whatever you want. Now, what this will do is that the CSSTransition component will automatically cycle through a couple of CSS classes and merge them to the div here, the div it wraps, or any element it wraps, of course, depending on the state of the CSS transition or of the transition in general. The classes it cycles through are your trunk, so fade-slide in our case, and then -enter, which is attached right at the point of time it starts entering, enter active, which will be kept attached whilst it is in the entering mode. So in our case, whilst it is running through this duration of 400 milliseconds. The -enter class, on the other hand, will be removed right after one frame. And we also got -exit, which is attached right when we start exiting, and exit active. So it's our job to now add these various classes to our application in any global CSS file or a file scope to this component where we want. In our case, I'll add it to modal CSS. So there I will add a .fadeSlide.enter class. Then I'll add a FadeSlideEnterActive class. Then I'll add a FadeSlideExit class. And then a FadeSlideExitActive class. These are now all the classes I can define and fill with live, and which will get added to the wrapped element, to this div in our case, depending on the state of the transition. Now back in our modal CSS file, we got animations already. So let's take the animation for opening a modal, and we now could add it to FadeSlideEnter or EnterActive. As I mentioned, enter as well as exit will be removed after one frame. We can use these classes to do some initialization, like for example set the opacity to 0 at the start of the animation. But enter active and exit active is where we then play the actual animation. So it is here that I add the animation property. And the same for closing. I'll add it to exit active. I'll leave the other two classes empty, and we could of course therefore remove them. Now with that, if we save all files and we go back to the application, if we click open modal, we're playing the animations from before again. But now we don't manually have to assign CSS classes and join them together. Instead, now we're taking advantage of the CSS transition component, which moves through these CSS classes based on our trunk automatically. And therefore, you often find yourself using CSS transition. It often is the more convenient component to use, since you can control the entire animation in CSS code by simply defining these CSS classes.